Welcome to the video presentation of the exhibition Artists' Dialogue between Jošt Dolinšek with his exhibition To Move the Sun and Earth Away and Joteva with Biogram Blueprints. At Photon Gallery, we have been juxtaposing two artists in the Artists' Dialogue section for several years now. It is mainly dedicated to photographers of the younger and middle generations from the region of Central and East Europe. This year, the term dialogue is placed in the additional context of the Open Call Different Worlds, which we organize annually. The Open Call, which already ran in its 8th edition in 2020, is aimed at young emerging artists in the field of contemporary art photography that likewise come from the Central East European region. This year's dialogue brings together two finalists from two different editions, the winner for 2020, Jošt Dolinšek from Slovenia, and a finalist for 2018, Joteva from Bulgaria. Aside from being finalists of the Open Call, these two visual artists share a highly conceptual approach to photography that they combine with innovative upgrades both on a formal and also on a technical plane in their work. They now present two independent projects, each in its own space of Photon Gallery.
To Move the Sun and Earth Away is a photographic and sound project exploring the human perception of nature and environment. How deeply rooted is the sense of otherness in connection to nature, and how biased is our perspective on environment. The project itself was created between the years 2019 and 2020. One of the key concepts of this work is the concepts of dualism, which is a clear distinction and separation between two entities. The physical form itself came from this idea, and so the mirrors in front of the images play a role of blurring the one-sided view on the photographs, and thus enable practically infinite number of different perspectives on photographs. The exhibition itself was created to be as a kind of a perceptual playground in which the viewer has to engage with the photographs in order to perceive them in their entirety. Beside the photographs, there are also three soundscapes which originate from field recordings, which were later cut, distorted, and composed into new pieces. With this, I also question the dualism between computerly generated sound and the sounds of nature. The other dualisms that I question with this work are, for example, reason versus nature, as well as fact versus fiction, denial versus acceptance. Recently, I have focused a bit on the exploration of the sculptural aspect of photography. With this, I'm interested in the idea of a photograph as a subliminal object that needs to be fully perceived in order to be explored first. This can be seen as an artwork, as a puzzle, which needs to be engaged with and demands a certain amount of activation from the viewer in order to be fully perceived. Therefore, I try to use the capacity of image not to reveal the invisible or unseen to us, but rather to show what is lost in our perception.
I started this project with a desire to work with things that we can't see in order to produce an image. I've always been really interested in the light spectrum, especially how subtle frequencies that are not directly perceivable to us can actually affect us. So the project mainly works with ultraviolet and infrared light to produce images and offer a different view on the act of memory preservation through a combination of different measuring technologies. I was inspired by Anna Atkins's work on documenting fauna with cyanotypes, which require ultraviolet light to produce images. She was not only the first woman photographer to produce a book, but her work was also used by botanists to study the structures of plants. Her images, however, are two-dimensional. She made them by placing plants directly on the chemically treated paper. And I thought it would be really interesting to combine this first photographic imaging process with the most contemporary one, especially with the emergence of 3D scanning technologies and the use of the infrared end of the invisible light spectrum to compute spatial dimensions of an object. This is a contemporary technology that is used in our smartphone devices for facial recognition, and it works by blasting an array of infrared points and measuring the time of flight of their return back to the sensor. So in my project, I start by 3D scanning 5 living plants with a LiDAR scanner, which allows me to produce a 3-dimensional point cloud data of each plant. And after that, after the 3D scanning of the plants, I use a virtual camera in a software called Houdini to photograph the data points of each plant from different angles. And then I collage them all together into one single image to make large-scale contact negatives for the cyanotypes. The process of making the composition for the negatives is very intuitive. I use virtual photographs of the same plant and compose them together into one plane. I was really interested in how I can most efficiently collapse a 3-dimensional object into a 2-dimensional space in order to reimagine how we capture and perceive images. And at the time, I was thinking a lot about the relationship of image making to the preservation and recall of a memory. I was particularly interested in how memory is dependent on multisensory inputs, and how the very act of remembering is a kind of actualization of the virtual potential in our minds. So at the time, I was inspired by Brian Masumi's research on synesthesia, which is a condition in which sense perceptions from one sense become available in another sense, resulting in the ability to, for example, see sounds or taste shapes. And in line with my research, I found the most curious aspect of synesthesia to be that the act of remembering is a perceptual event. Many people with this condition use abstract, liminal, topographic memory maps that are kind of composed of different senses, tenses, and dimensions on one single experiential surface. They describe them as existing in a kind of dimensionless plane between the eyes and the objects of the world. In his book Parables for the Virtual, Masumi extends the definition of a diagram to a biogram as a kind of sensory event perception that is positioned neither in time nor space, thus rendering the presence as a mode of abstraction. And I borrowed this term for the title of my cyanotypes in order to link a seemingly objective and scientific view of a plant to the more abstracted perception that is experienced in the most sensory-dependent act of recalling a memory. In this way, the biogram blueprints kind of function as abstract memory maps, not only employing a visual flattening of the plant information, but also through the process of flattening the two ends of the visible spectrum of light and these two technologies from 2 points in time. I was also thinking a lot about how memories constantly update and change in our mind. Every time we recall something, our memory of it changes. So I was excited to bring this element of livelihood to the prints. And the final step in the production of the prints is that I developed them only partially. So in some of the prints that you can see, this is very evident as the darker streaks or drips. In these areas of the prints, the chemistry is still actively changing according to the amount of ultraviolet light and the precipitation in its immediate environment. And this was really important for me because I want the prints to have a sense of being alive in the present moment and constantly changing in relationship to the space there. In the show at Photon Gallery, you can also see an accompanying light installation, which presents the data points of the 5 3D scanned plants. The installation is a rear projection onto a suspended disc, and it shows the 3-dimensional data points of these plants in a kind of animated, constant fluctuation, slowly morphing in and out of each other. It's called zero-point field, which was inspired by a phenomenon in quantum physics, where scientists are able to measure subatomic field fluctuations, even in conditions below absolute 0 degrees. This really inspired me to consider how everything around us in a subatomic level is in a process of constant particle exchange, which you can really see in the animated projection. And in the installation, the light is projected through a diffraction grating commonly used in other quantum physics experiments. But its function in the piece is to split the white light into a full visible spectrum and kind of further expand the viewer's perception into what is not seemingly visible to their eyes.